Okay, calm down, everybody. It is time for another episode of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. My name is David Parsons, and as always, I'm happy that you're listening to the show. And I want to give a special shout out and thank you to the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. It is really, the $5 a month that a few people are giving, or it's really like keeping the show alive. I want to do more than that, though. I want to move beyond precarity, like so many of us in the United States right now. I want to move beyond the paycheck to paycheck, barely alive feeling of this podcast, and I want to grow the thing, and I want to get these ideas out there. I want to start doing live shows. I have plans for the Nostalgia Trap. Me and Peter Sabatino, who's my producer, we have lots of stuff we want to do, but we're not able to do it because we both work all the time and really have very little money, extra money, or time to devote to the Nostalgia Trap. So please support this project. If only like 10% of the people that listen to this show gave $5 a month, I wouldn't have to ask every time. I know how that's kind of annoying. You're here to listen to an interview with Thomas Frank, which I promise you is coming in just a few minutes. But if you enjoy this show and you enjoy the type of stuff we're doing, we want to do a lot more. So please consider going to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Sign up to become a patron. Give me $5 a month. I'll send you stickers and buttons and other stuff. And we've got a bunch of bonus episodes coming too. So the more patrons I can get, the more Nostalgia Trap stuff will be out there, and the more we'll be able to explore this project, which is really all I want to do is kind of create this archive of oral history of people that have devoted themselves to studying the major problems that we're facing in our era, their historical, the background of these historical, the historical background of these problems, I should say, but also tracing a kind of wider trajectory, and that's the kind of the kind of point of view that I want to get across on this show, is that there is a kind of larger timeline that we're working on, and there is there tends to be a really myopic and narrow point of view presented to Americans in most media. And so this podcast is a chance to kind of sit back with someone who is generally really smart. And I'm not talking about me, but my guests. I want to hear what they have to say, and I'm trying to collect this kind of archive of voices about American history and about where we're at. So if that's a project that you can get on board with, please invest in the show at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Okay, enough of that. Let's get to our guest today. Today, I got to talk to Thomas Frank, who I'm sure many of the people who listen to this show know who Thomas Frank is. He's someone who's written a lot of books, had a lot of ideas out there, but perhaps the most famous of those is a book called What's the Matter with Kansas, in which he attempted to explain why so many Americans, particularly in the quote-unquote middle of the country, tend to vote for the Republican Party, despite the Republican Party being a force of devastation towards their particularly economic well-being, or their material well-being. So that thesis has been challenged a lot over the years, but we talk about, not just that, but kind of what he's doing, and how his viewpoints have changed, how he's developed as a kind of political thinker, and why he is now moving towards writing about business culture again, which I find really fascinating. I think I first came to Thomas Frank's work through his work on the Baffler and Commodify Your Dissent, which is a collection of Baffler pieces that came out in the 90s. We talk about all that stuff. We talk about his book Conquest of Cool, which discusses the kind of co-optation of counterculture by major corporations in the wake of the 1960s and 70s. So much that Thomas Frank talks about helps explain kind of the wider history and politics of our era. So I had a great time talking with him. I hope you enjoy listening to him, and I hope you enjoy all of the Nostalgia Trap, which you can find more of at nostalgiatrap.com. We have a Twitter account at Nostalgia Trap. Check that out. On Instagram, Facebook, wherever you do social media garbage, we're producing content, and we want to produce a lot more. So again, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Please become a patron of the show and help us grow this project. All right. Thanks very much. I appreciate all the people who support the show one way or another. Have a nice day and enjoy this interview. This is me talking with writer and historian Thomas Frank. Thanks for talking with me. You're a name who has come up a lot in the years that I've been studying American history and American politics. And this show is called The Nostalgia Trap. We kind of like to go back in time and think about the different kind of political and historical things that came to us when we were young and how they shaped our worldview. But I can certainly remember in the 90s at some point, or maybe the early 2000s, being at a friend's house in LA and seeing a copy of Commodify Your Dissent on their coffee table. I'd never heard of you or Baffler or anything related to it. I think I might have been like into McSweeney's at the time, and it caught my eye because it looked like a McSweeney's cover a little bit. But either way, opening that book.
I think it was before. I don't think McSweeney's had started then in '97. I think they were later on.
That makes sense.
But I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I at once upon a time I would have known the answer to that.
Well, either way, it kind of it caught my eye, and opening that book and cracking that book over when I was at this person's house, it made me think that. I realized that there was this whole like thing called the left that had things to say that connected to things I cared about, and I had no idea. And so your name and your kind of association with a particular politics had an impact on me for sure. And so I wanted to kind of talk to you a little bit about where you came from and how you became who you are. You are from Kansas originally, right?
Yes, I'm from the Kansas suburbs of Kansas City. The city is mainly in Missouri, but it has some suburbs that are in Kansas, and that's where I grew up.
How much was politics or talking about politics a feature of your family life or your growing up?
Well, family life not so much, but I was very interested. I was always interested in politics. It was the 1970s. It wasn't it wasn't a time like today where politics is in every, it's just in your face all the time today. You open up Facebook and there it is. It wasn't like that then, but it was a very political time. People were obsessed with the idea of national decline,
mm-hmm.
and then Reagan, the idea of national revival.
Right,
in fact, it was really similar to, Trump basically swiped, that Make America Great Again, swiped that from Reagan. That was his idea, was to replay the whole Reagan versus Carter thing.
And it worked in some kind of amazing.
It did. I still can't get over that.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, people on the left and people, whether they be liberals or further left than that, I think are still, a year and a half later, still kind of unpacking and in a state of being stunned by the election and trying to figure out what happened. But it might be that simple that that Make America Great Again message resonates and certainly resonates during certain times.
There's more to it than that, but that is we read all sorts of awful things into that saying, "Make America Great Again." But at the end of the day, he is just recapitulating what Reagan did. He's just trying to, do what trace Reagan's footsteps.
So,
down to appointing. So this is what I'm writing about today. Appointing Larry Kudlow to run his National Economic Council.
I'm sorry, it's hard not to laugh about like these.
It's just like
this parade of cartoon characters.
I can't believe it's happening.
Yeah. When growing up and coming of age, it sounds like you were coming of age around the time that Reagan is rising. I
was 15 in 1980.
Oh wow, okay. So what were you thinking when you were 15 in 1980, looking at Reagan? Because I feel like a lot of 15-year-olds fell into that stuff.
I was one of those. Yeah,
yeah.
Exactly. I was very much one of those, and I had been an admirer of Carter. Because, everyone was. In 1976, he was so earnest and honest, and he was so straightforward and a breath of fresh air. He was something completely new. And I remember watching the Malaise speech on TV and that would have been 79, and thinking what a fine man he was. Like, no president had ever said stuff like this before. He was trying to be a philosopher as president. Which you think about it now, it just seems like what a silly thing to try and do when you're president of the United States. But I thought it was very impressive. But the Iran hostage crisis, the price of gasoline, the sense of national decline was just overwhelming in those days. And Reagan also, Reagan was on the radio all the time back then before he became president. And I bought into Reagan's mythology, big time.
Yeah.
Because in some ways it was made for children. It was made for people my age. It was this very simple vision of a world where everything fit together almost geometrically. And I found it persuasive.
It seems like in a weird way, even though they're often cast as these opposites, it feels like Carter paved the way for Reagan by kind of like making politics about kind of feeling better and like feeling better during a time when people felt rather badly about their nation, particularly around issues like Vietnam and this thing you call national decline, or what people were calling national decline. It seems like Carter and Reagan both were kind of hitting on the same kind of affect. I imagine that tons of people who voted for Carter voted for Reagan, right?
Oh, well, of course, that's always how these big elections work. Yeah. And what we didn't. I think we did understand at the time that the country. I mean, we certainly understood it with Reagan that the country was heading on a new course. The 70s were over, and we were adopting an entirely new way of approaching things. Although it had been underway already with Jimmy Carter. But for example, the war on organized labor. Labor was a very important player in the 1970s. And when Reagan becomes president, one of the very first things was the Patco strike.
That's right. Yep.
And that was by itself not very significant, but it was a signal that that the government was from now on on the other side of this question. And and it was everywhere all of a sudden. Anyhow, but it was a gigantic transition.
Yeah.
Carter to Reagan, and it was a symbolic transition. It was a kind of ideological transition, but then also the big picture stuff that I'm talking about, the transition to what we now call neoliberalism.
Well, I mean, we'll get to that. I wanted to kind of think about, how you as Thomas Frank and, being 15 in 1980, that time, I think the change between 15 to 25 years old is the entire 1980s for you. So it seems like, what happened in those years, and where did you go to school, and how did that affect your kind of ideas and viewpoints?
So I went to the University of Kansas for 1 year, and then I transferred to the University of Virginia.
Okay.
And then went there instead. And gradually I moved away from Reaganism, and from the Republicans. It was a case of gradually waking up to reality. That in fact the world of business, which is so important to Reagan, obviously, that it wasn't anything like what ideology said it was. I mean, it wasn't even remotely like it. And it was also, I was 15 when he got elected.
Right.
And it was as you grow up and you just discover things aren't like your leaders say they are at all. And I was not really at age 15 acquainted with the wider world of history and things going on in other countries. I didn't know anything about that.
Yeah.
And as I learned about that, I started to move away from that childhood ideology.
It's kind of incredible that that you kind of have to gain some ability to read between the lines in order to see what's really going on. I know that's kind of a common idea.
Well, no, it was even more simple than that. I got a job,
Yep.
like a summer job when I was in college, and guess what? The workplace is not at all what the sort of capitalist theory says it is.
Right. Yeah, I think we've talked about that's come up on this program a number of times. Kind of like the people's experiences with the workplace are often intensely radicalizing one way or the other.
Yeah.
So
yep, and
yeah.
also my experience with learning. Going to college and learning about the wide world. In particular, and this is sort of interest today. I learned about populism, and that sounds kind of like an odd thing, but Reagan was a populist. Reagan used this kind of language of the people versus the elite all the time, and so did of course the right wing then, and they were very good at it, and they continue to do it to this day. They continue to ride that hobby horse, and they will until someone stops them. And at some point in college, I discovered that populism had actually historically been a tradition of the left. And this was a huge surprise to me. A huge surprise. Shocking,
right, Right. Yeah.
And I became really interested in it. And it was a sort of slow awakening, but that's been my life's work has been talking about that. I kind of want to get away from it. But it just keeps going.
And I feel like you have a weird kind of blessing and curse in that you've written a couple of books and created a couple ideas that have a lot of currency in the way that people talk about politics. The idea of like what's the matter with Kansas became kind of a shorthand for a whole like kind of set of attitudes and political ideas. It must be something. I don't know. Do you ever feel like that you want to get away from what's the matter with Kansas and all that stuff?
Well, it's a good book, and I'm proud of it.
I agree. I use it in my classes.
And you go back and look at it, and it's not anything like the kind of simplistic shorthand version that. Just the other day I was reading someone who was all pissed off because liberals are look down on conservatives and say, you're voting against your own interests, and attributed this to me. And it's like, well, that's how the book starts, but that's the first page.
Yeah,
It goes from there. It tries to answer that question by actually talking to those people and reading their literature and understand. It's not. It's just a. It's this massively oversimplified version of it that has that people have that people think that's what it is, and it's not that at all.
Right, I agree,
The book ends with a chapter blasting the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
And that's where I picked up with Listen Liberal was that the last chapter of What's the Matter with Kansas. But people don't remember any of that. They remember the first page.
Yeah, and they kind of contribute or attribute this kind of like smug liberal looking down upon those people thing to your writing, which is actually, the idea of like people voting against their interests, the kind of the criticism that people would throw at that is that, there's a complicated thing that we call interest. It's not one thing or another, but you consider all that in the book.
That's what I tried to unpack, right?
Right.
The thing, because this is the story of my life. We were talking about Reagan a second ago.
Yep.
That people loved that man. They were so enthusiastic about him, and then about Gingrich, and then about George Bush, and now about Trump, Tea Party movement, Donald Trump.
Sure.
These are all popular movements, and all of them have hurt the life chances of ordinary people. Inequality has gotten worse and worse and worse and worse and worse in this country, and we keep signing up for these movements.
Yeah.
And if you think Donald Trump is going to help out those people that those people in the Rust Belt that are so desperate for America to be made great again, he's not.
Yeah,
I've got news for you. It's not going to happen. But so that's what the question means. People voting against their own interests. That is what modern history is in this country. Inequality gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. The whole middle class society that I grew up in is tottering toward the grave, and we have done it. We have voted for it. Why does this happen?
Yeah.
It's a good question. And then
probably one of the more vital questions.
If you think about it, that is the question of our times.
Yeah, right.
and I've spent my entire career trying to answer it.
Yeah.
And to brush it off as an inappropriate question, I think is a terrible mistake.
Well, I agree, and I want to get to because it seems like by the '90s you have a very kind of you have a really clear idea of where you're headed when you're talking about politics and what the ideas that you want to get out there. How did that happen? How did you go from kind of a person that's kind of like a young person in college, kind of coming to new ideas and realizing things like populism exist? How did you get from that point to having like such clarity in your political writing? I guess one way of saying that is, when did you start writing about politics?
Well, in the early days of The Bachelor, we never did. I wanted to be a cultural historian, and in fact, I went and got a PhD in that subject. And my first book was about the advertising industry in the 1960s.
The Conquest of Cool.
The Conquest of Cool, yeah. And that's, by the way, that was another really interesting question: is how did the advertising industry, how did capitalism become so cool?
Right. Yes.
After being so square in the 1950s, what happened? How did that work? It's a really interesting subject.
Yeah, and that kind of fake rebel thing that corporations sell you.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and we were very interested in that.
Yeah.
At the time.
Yeah, that's actually what caught my mind.
Your dissent.
Yeah, that's exactly what caught my eyes. That idea of because in the '90s there's and this to me this is kind of validates your thesis 100%, is the idea that the concept of selling out has gone away. That they're in the night.
Yes, I've noticed that.
Yeah, like no one cares about that anymore. Like you see, like Spike Jonze, who was at one point arguably kind of a counterculturist figure. He's like doing Apple commercials, and that's like not something that people go, oh man, Spike Jonze is no longer an artist. People actually celebrate that, and like the Apple commercial is where art can be made. And it seems like that kind of confluence of artists and the kind of people that are making culture and the corporations and advertisers is something that there's no line between that anymore, and there seemed to be a line.
You're right. Now I haven't, like I said, I have not looked into this for a long time, and it's that's a really good point. And everything that I've seen anecdotally points to you're right about that. That attitude which was so strong and part of our world in those days, in the 80s and the 90s, has completely evaporated.
Yeah.
Or not completely, but largely evaporated.
Well, it's just like the dominance. I mean, it kind of connects to the neoliberal thing.
The way that we accept capitalism in every aspect of life, in a way that would have been unthinkable not all that long ago.
Yeah,
that is all correct. Anyhow, so Kansas was my first openly political book.
Yeah.
Where I decided I would actually investigate this question that really is the question of my life. How did we, that goes back to Reagan. How did we as a society make this mistake? We were the great middle class society, and look what's happened. How did we do that to ourselves? We're still a democracy, and all of those earlier efforts, those writing about the conquest of cool and the commodification of dissent, and all that stuff. And if you look at, I wrote a book called One Market Under God, which is, by the way, Larry Kudlow is a character in it.
Yeah.
It's about what I called market populism. It's the way that business imagines itself in the world, as a kind of a voice for the common people.
Yeah. And it seems like businesses figured out something that along the lines of Reagan. This kind of like make them feel good.
That's right, but it's all the gears are all intermeshed with each other. But that was the ideology of the bull market in the 90s, and I would study that, but I was fascinated by business culture. Fascinated.
Yeah.
And then at some point it dawned on me that the business was this essential element of American life, but at some point I had to understand the politics of it. And
it's weird because
that's how I decided to start writing about politics.
Yeah.
Now, just for the record, I've now decided to stop writing about politics. I'm so relieved, I want to retrace my steps and get out of this labyrinth.
Are you doing poetry and novels now, or what are you doing?
No, I'm following the breadcrumbs back to where I left off, and
Nice.
I'm going to go back to writing about business culture again.
Oh, beautiful. Nice.
Yeah.
I think it's a real strength of yours. I mean, The Conquest of Cool, that book I read in graduate school as I was preparing to talk about, I ended up writing about the 60s and 70s in my work, and like a lot about the hippie counterculture and that kind of stuff. And it was really useful to kind of see how a lot of that stuff got co-opted, and how, in a lot of ways, and it was inadvertent, this kind of cultural explosion in the 1960s and 1970s of counterculture, do what you want kind of stuff, actually gave business a language through which they could survive a crisis. And I use
weird.
that example.
And an ideology.
Yeah.
And it reinforced it. Well, the ideology already existed, but the way that youth culture just plugged right in.
Yeah.
It just fit right in. So that's the kind of pessimistic Tom Frank, and
Yes.
that Tom Frank would, what you were saying just a second ago about how the whole concept of selling out has disappeared. That pessimistic Tom Frank would be like, "Yep, that's right.
Right.
Sure enough.
Yeah.
Of course that's what happened."
Because there's nothing to sell out to anymore. It's all one unit. It's all, you're sold out from the beginning of your day.
Selling out would be redefined as something else.
Right.
I don't know what. I haven't paid attention for a long time, but being inauthentic in some way.
Right.
Not being good at your performance. I don't know.
Yeah. No, there's a lot going on there. I mean, it seems like you're interested in. I mean, I don't know. The business culture isn't necessarily. I wouldn't necessarily put something like left or right on business culture, weirdly enough, in terms of the politics of it. But like, it seems like early in your career you were interested in writing about the right. You were kind of interested in writing about and exploring the
absolutely,
Republicans.
because they're the dominant power of our time.
But
so
now
again,
you've got this.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. But I just wanted to point out that you have a book called Listen Liberal now, where you're kind of talking about what happened in the left as well.
Yes.
Right.
So that is right.
Yeah.
I go after everybody. I'm an equal opportunity writer.
Well, yeah. I mean, how did that switch to take place for you? How did you kind of feel like it was time to write about what happened with the Democratic Party? Because it feels like it's writing about the big bad right wing, and the 90s were a time when it was like, I don't know, the right wing was, even though Bill Clinton was in office, it felt like the right wing had control of I don't know, the discourse in some way.
Yeah, that's because they did.
Yeah.
And Clinton was one of them. And Clinton, although he came across, Clinton is in some ways embodies all of my the thesis we're describing here better than Reagan. Clinton comes out of the counterculture. Clinton is his anti-war guy in the 60s, leader of his generation, and winds up getting... and has, he gets Fleetwood Mac back together for his inauguration.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah. I know.
And, this is a guy who winds up getting much more of the Reagan agenda accomplished than Reagan himself. Much more. The deregulation of banks, the Republicans couldn't do that. They tried. They couldn't get it done. Clinton got it done. NAFTA, the Republicans wrote that, but Clinton got it passed. Welfare reform, the Republicans would never have dared to do that on their own. There would have been enormous protests all over this country.
Yeah.
But Clinton got it done.
Yeah,
and many other things as well. And he accomplished their agenda much more effectively than they ever did. But you're asking the meta question: how did I come to this? I'd written about the right. I wrote 3 books about conservatism, although the third one, Pity the Billionaire, isn't, really about. It's about the Tea Party movement in the context of the Obama years.
That's right. Yep.
But it was obvious to me that the conservative movement were the people to be watching in this period that we're in. They had the pendulum has swung their way. They are the dominant group, even though numerically they still aren't. Right? The Democrats are still the natural majority party, even after all these years.
Is that just the electoral college then that explains why Trump wins and things?
No, it's an enormous question why they keep
they keep losing
doing so well, even though they don't have the numbers.
Yeah, I often wonder who the Democratic Party is. Who's the base of the Democratic Party anymore? Because you've written about how that
goes on and on, but it's this sort of endless series of populist tricks that they pull off. That are. Anyhow, that's all part of the question. But you start to realize that what makes this era that we're in distinct from other eras. You've had conservatives all along. You've had people who believed in this ideology, the free market ideology, all along. What we call neoliberalism. That's existed for a long time. What's different about today is that there's a consensus around these things, that both sides agree on these things. And you look at something like the Washington Post, which is supposedly very liberal and which attacks President Trump with literally every single columnist on the page.
Right.
There's not anyone that stands up for the president, right? Not anyone.
Right.
And yet in their editorials written by their editorial board, they are still, to this day, all the time calling for what they call reform what they call entitlement reform, which means basically privatizing Social Security.
Right.
This is a liberal newspaper.
Owned by Jeff Bezos of Amazon.com, right?
Yeah, but they've been like this for a long time.
Yeah,
They've been like this since long before.
Well, my point is that they represent the ruling class interests, whether they go after Trump or not.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So how do so what's going on here? So you've got these ideas have become a consensus ideas agreed upon by people on both sides. How'd that happen? And the answer is is Clinton. The answer is the Democrats. You have to look at the Democratic Party too. If you want to understand the consensus, you have to look at the other side. How did the other side give up this fight?
Yeah.
And that's the question. So, the question of what's the matter with Kansas is how did the conservatives win? How did they pull this off? And the question of listen liberal is how did the other side come to surrender?
Yeah, and that has to do with, it seems like, I've read some of your ideas on this. It seems like one transformation that happens is that the Democratic Party begins shifting after 1968, and I wonder if you could give a little more detail on this, but like shifting its perspective and its kind of efforts away from the working class and towards this kind of professional managerial class.
That's exactly right.
How did that happen? Why did they do that? What was the thinking behind that?
It's funny because all of these things come together, don't they? It had to do again with the counterculture and the kids and the Vietnam War. The things that I was writing about in the Conquest of Cool.
Right.
But it's the 68 was obviously this big wrenching disaster of an election for the Democrats. Lyndon Johnson didn't run. He was the incumbent, but he withdrew, and so they ran Hubert Humphrey instead, and he lost. And he lost by a very narrow margin. But remember there were riots in Chicago, during the Democratic Convention. The country was up in arms about the Vietnam War, which was really Lyndon Johnson's baby. He was responsible for that.
Yeah.
And it was a Democratic, the Democratic Party had got us into that war, and there was no question about it.
And also, it seems like it was literally, Martin Luther King gave a speech in 1967 about Vietnam, in which he kind of aimed his criticism at Lyndon Johnson specifically for abandoning the ideas of the Great Society and like abandoning that kind of old school liberalism in favor of funding the Vietnam War. So it's like that is true, and that's an exact. That is the tragedy of Lyndon Johnson. Right.
The war came to overshadow everything else he was doing. If it hadn't been for that, we would regard him as a kind of Franklin Roosevelt figure. A great leader, a man who did unbelievably good things.
Right.
The whole war on poverty, the Medicare, the Voting Rights Act. This man accomplished amazing things, but Vietnam brought it all down. Anyhow, so 68, the Democratic Party, they lose, and they even though they lose by just a tiny little bit, they say this is a terrible defeat, and we have to reconsider who we are as a party.
Mm-hmm.
And what they decided to do, they set up a commission to look into this. It was called the McGovern Commission. He was a senator from South Dakota at the time, and they decided to reform the party's presidential nominating process. And you know how in America we never seem to tackle the big things head on. We do them kind of sideways.
Right.
We destroyed organized labor via NAFTA, by
Yeah.
a free trade agreement. You would never think of that, but there's many examples of that kind of thing. Anyhow, so they decided to reform the Democratic Party, and through this process, they completely changed who the Democratic Party was. And the first thing they decided to do, they did many things, some of them healthful, some of them good, but one of the things they decided to do was to remove organized labor from its position of power in the Democratic Party. So up until then, the Democratic Party and organized labor were basically two arms of the same creature.
Right.
They were very, very close.
Uh-huh.
And they set out to change that, and they did. And they decided they wanted a different sort of constituency to be central to the Democratic Party, and that constituency was going to be what they would have said at the time, college, kids. What they meant were professionals. Well, they would also use the word professionals,
Right.
but they weren't talking about older people at the time. They were talking about young people. And so they meant people like Bill Clinton and his cohort. Kids coming out of the good colleges, always the good. They weren't talking about kids going to community colleges.
Right.
They're talking about kids, whenever they talked about protesters in those days, they always meant people at Berkeley or at, Columbia.
Yep.
Or at, one of a prestigious school.
Right.
Or where did Hillary go? Wellesley, or Bill Clinton went to Georgetown, Yale. That's who they were talking about. That's who they have in mind. And this was successful. They succeeded in changing the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party has never, and by the way, they are open about this. They wrote all over the place about this is what we're doing. This is who we see as our new core constituency. Goodbye organized labor. Labor saw this happening. They were very upset about it.
Yeah,
as
I would imagine.
Couldn't stop it.
Yeah,
they couldn't do it. And everybody saw this happening. It was much discussed in the media at the time. It was not a secret. What's interesting about it is that it has led to disaster after disaster after disaster, not just for the Democratic Party, but for the country.
Right.
Income inequality has grown and grown. All the things that we're talking about here have been made possible by this change. But the Democratic Party has never looked back. They've never said, "Yeah, that was a bad move. We should go back and reconsider that."
It seems like now, the Democratic Party is doubling down on so much of this stuff. But listening to you talk a little bit about the Democratic Party like dumping labor in the late '60s and through the '70s. It's such a tragic, insane thing, but it's also like, how would you even go back to it now? Because labor is unions have declined. I think it's like, the number of people in unions is nothing, but also the whole kind of like, I don't know, the industries that were unionized before have gone away too, right? It's like,
yep, that's right.
That
was part of the, of course, the sort of Republican plan was to wage war on the unionized industry. That's exactly right. And look, in the one of the reasons that these guys did this in the 70s was because a lot of the leadership of organized labor supported the Vietnam War.
Right.
You can understand why they did it. This was the stereotype at the time, the hard hat, standing up for the flag, you know, and it was a stereotype, but there was some validity to it, and that's why they did it. They could never have seen at the time, this is 1972 we're talking about, this is sort of the high watermark of social equality in America, when wealth was probably most evenly distributed in this country's history was when they did this. They could never have seen what they were the forces they were setting in motion. They had no idea that by doing this they were effectively destroying, the working class lives. These were people that they were destroying the power of unions. They could have never seen that. The unions were extremely powerful in 1972. It would have never occurred to them that they were making a blunder that would change the face of this country.
And they're counting on what? They're counting on this base being now this professional class of middle class white collar people that are supposed to be
affluent white collar. The key word here is enlightened. We're talking about the late 60s and the early 70s here, and there was this another stereotype that was abroad in the land was this stereotype of the enlightened youth, that they were wiser than their parents.
You're seeing that today. People always like to kind of fetishize young people as geniuses.
I mean, you've studied this period. The culture was, we were talking a second ago about the culture in the 90s being crazy about the new economy and about the internet. Well, they were crazy about kids then. They were crazy about youth. And you could say the most preposterous things about young people and people, and how enlightened and soulful and spiritually advanced they were, and people would believe you.
Right.
It was everywhere back then. It was in the culture, and that's what they did. And it just seems ridiculous now. And when you look back at it, and that's what I did in Listen Liberal. I quote a whole lot of this crap. But they decided to reorganize the Democratic Party, and eventually the where this yields fruit is finally Bill Clinton. Finally this works in the 1990s, and Bill Clinton gets elected. Bill Clinton stabs labor in the back with NAFTA.
Yep.
Bill Clinton represents professionals love him, and now it is. I mean, all of this stuff is the transition is complete. You saw Hillary Clinton the other day in that talk in India, where she was saying basically the Democratic Party, my voters, represent what did she say? Like 2/3 of the gross.
And the people that vote for Trump are in backwards places that are looking backwards.
And her people are the forward-looking, productive members of society. The two parties have changed position.
Right.
I mean, the Democrats were the party of, when I was young, the Democrats were the party of, and the party of the outs, the party of people who were not in charge, who were not the wealthy ones, the ones who were doing really well. That's what the Democratic Party. That's why the Democratic Party existed. And it's completely reversed today.
Do you see Obama as kind of tied to that same trend as the Clintons, as being in the same mode? I feel like Obama is kind of like a mega Bill Clinton in the way that he played American culture and American cultural ideas about being enlightened and all that kind of stuff. Do you see Obama in the same mode as the Clintons?
Ultimately, yes.
Yeah.
But he didn't start out that way. When he got elected in 2008, I saw him very differently, and I think I was right to see him differently. He had deliberately shunned the main, centrist Democratic organizations, the Democratic Leadership Council, they were called. I mean, nobody remembers that anymore. But he had definitely had an arm's length with them. He would not have anything to do with Bill Clinton's organization. He defeated Hillary in the primaries.
That's right. Very bitter primary.
He seemed to understand the failures of free market capitalism much better than anybody else out there.
Mm-hmm.
He gave these amazing speeches about what was wrong with Wall Street. And you remember, this is during the financial crisis and the Great Recession, and people thought he was the next Franklin Roosevelt.
Yeah.
I certainly thought that.
Yeah.
That was my. And I mean, I remember on Time magazine they had this cover where they photoshopped his face onto a picture of Roosevelt. He was going to be the next Roosevelt. He's going to step up during this terrible financial crisis, and he was going to set things right in exactly the same way. And he never did that. And in some ways, Obama is the missed I like to say we came to the turning point in this country in '08, and we missed the turn.
Yeah, right.
But
that didn't affect his popularity among liberals. That's a kind of amazing is that he remains this incredibly popular figure among liberals all through his presidency, despite the fact that he wasn't that FDR figure. And not only was he not that FDR figure, he seemed to be exactly the opposite of that.
That's right. Hanging around. Yes, he brought in all these people from Wall Street to run his administration, and then refused to get tough with the big banks.
But Democrats, mainstream Democrats, don't care about that because he makes them feel good, and that seems
and they're also not who we think they are anymore. They're not the party. I mean, in some ways, they are the party of Wall Street. I mean, the transition has.
Yeah.
The transition has happened. I mean, this transition that someone would have laughed at 20 years ago, it has happened.
Oh, it's so scary.
You look at Obama's biggest donors in '08, and it was all the investment banks. And then.
God, that explains the virulent hatred of Bernie Sanders from mainstream Democrats.
Oh, absolutely.
Because he represents taking the party in a direction away from where it's been going.
But okay, let's stick to one subject at a time here.
Sorry.
So, Obama and the great sort of missed moment.
Yeah.
I mean, you asked about why is he still so personally popular? I think it's because he is an amazing, personally inspiring figure.
Yeah.
And I myself, I'm very critical of Barack Obama in Listen Liberal, but I went to the Democrat, and I think he has a lot to answer for with the election of Trump.
Yeah.
He really played that poorly. I mean, that was just bad retail politics, real bad, stinky.
What do you mean by that?
He was, why was Hillary Clinton the candidate? Because Obama chose her.
Right.
Why not a stronger candidate? Because Obama wanted it to be Hillary and made sure that it happened. Then while the campaign is going along, he is out there pushing the TPP, apparently oblivious to the fact that every speech Trump is giving is about trade, and Hillary Clinton is really and Trump is stealing the blue-collar vote away, and Hillary is out there trying to deny that trade, that she's been bad on trade. Of course she has, but she's trying to get out of that. And here's Obama pushing the TPP all through the whole thing.
That's right. Then, I forgot about how tone deaf that was. That was really, really awful.
Mistake.
Yeah.
It was an unbelievable mistake. And then the last one that I'll mention. There are more, but the last one I'll mention is raising premiums on Obamacare right before Election Day.
Yeah.
What the fuck? What the fuck was that about?
That's right.
I mean, that's just bad politics.
Yeah.
You ask yourself, would Lyndon Johnson ever have done that?
Well, there was a smugness about Trump, and there still is, which is odd to me. This kind of laughing at him, he's never gonna. It's like he's president. He's in control of the federal government. It's weird to act like he's just going to be out of there tomorrow because of some Russian thing. It's instead this kind of feeling that
he's gonna get. I think he's gonna get. Well, we'll see how it unfolds, of course, but he has a good chance of being reelected.
I agree. Yeah, and so it's like that question that I'm with you. Kind of what are the Democrats doing? Because they seem like they are just undermining their ability to win.
They misplayed that moment so badly.
Yeah.
They misplayed the 16 moment. I mean, think of the mistakes they made that could have, and they only lost by a little bit. It could have, it could have been so different. For example, one that nobody thinks about. You talk about Hillary's blunders, and she made many mistakes on the campaign trail, but her VP choice, she deliberately did not reach out to the left wing of the party. She could have chosen a labor guy. She could have chosen a blue collar, someone that appealed to blue collar voters, like for example Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
He was obviously the figure of the moment. And the Bernie phenomenon was as much the story of 16 as was the Donald Trump phenomenon, and she deliberately chose to turn her back on that, and snub that wing of the party. Why? Because that's what the Democratic Leadership Council always does. That's what their people always do. Bill Clinton, her husband, had done the same thing. They have so much contempt for the left wing of the Democratic Party. It's always they expect the votes from those people. That they are entitled to the votes from those people. But the idea that you have to do anything, serve those people in any way, give those people anything in any way. They don't agree with that. They don't believe in that. Those people are to be counted upon to vote for you, but other than that, they're just treated with complete contempt. And she just blew it.
Yeah.
Missed the opportunity.
Did you?
But there's so many things like that. But
yeah,
I regard Obama not so much as he's very similar to Bill Clinton in a lot of ways, but what he is this country was screaming out to change course, and we got a guy in there who we thought was going to do it, and he didn't do it. He simply didn't do it.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I think the man to compare Obama to is Trump.
Huh.
These are both political phenoms. Here's a guy. Obama, remember, was a relatively unknown. Had only been in the Senate for 2 years and is running this campaign that just catches fire. These enormous rallies. People are looking to him to fix everything. Regarding him as a kind of savior. Very similar to Trump in that respect.
I agree. It feels like Trump ran a change you can believe in type campaign.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. Well, they're both populists.
Yep. And Hillary did not run that. Her message was not that. She's not a very good delivery person for the message anyway. But the message wasn't really there.
She was not.
America is already great.
Some that I've had all my life.
Yeah.
Is that the more populist of the two candidates always win.
Well, yeah, and her response that America is already great was to me just about the worst.
So bad.
Yeah,
so bad.
Talk about
Hillary.
tone-deaf politics. Jesus Christ. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, did you see this coming though? I feel like so many of us, and I'm one of them because I was reading, all sorts of voices in Brooklyn at the time that were predicting a massive Hillary Clinton win, and we didn't have to worry about it. And I kind of fell into that, and I think a lot of us did. That look, this neoliberal thing, whatever, is kind of Obama created a legacy that's going to cruise Clinton right into the White House, and it just didn't work out that way. Were you as shocked as everyone else was when that happened?
Shocked, yes, because the polls said that Hillary was going to win, but not surprised.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me tell you my own story about this. This is kind of an interesting moment for me. Is that I actually wrote the Guardian. I was writing columns for the Guardian, and I'd written a bunch of columns about Trump supporters, and these columns were really popular, more popular than almost anything I've ever written. Probably more popular than anything I've ever written.
Wow. And
the Guardian came to me and said, we think, this is about a week before the election, they said, we think Trump has a decent chance of winning. This is after the Comey memo. By the way, I voted for Hillary the day that I went and voted early. I voted for Hillary the day the Comey memo came out. I remember coming out of the polling place, turning on the engine of my car, and NPR comes on, and they are screaming about it.
And it's like you just voted for a criminal who should be in prison, Thomas.
No. I was just like, oh my God, oh, this is terrible.
Yeah.
But so the Guardian came to me the week before the election and said, we want you to write the Trump wins column.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, okay, I'll do it. And I sat down and started, because the first order of business was to talk myself into it.
Yeah. Right.
The Trump actually would win.
Because this is before the election. They're asking you to write this. Is that right?
This is well before. This is a week before the election. And I did. And I went down to Florida. I was in Florida, right near Trump's house, as a matter of fact. And you'd turn on the TV down there, and it was wall-to-wall Hillary commercials. She had so much more money than him for this campaign, and her TV commercials were everywhere. This is the ultimate swing state, and she is blanketing it with TV commercials. But you would drive out into the countryside, and it's all Trump signs.
Yeah.
And you go on Trump's page, and Trump's rallies right up until the end. Even though every poll said Hillary had it, Trump's rallies were enormous, and they were not diminishing. And he was having like more and more of them. As it drew to a close. And he had also rolled out this new slogan, "Drain the swamp." All these details. It doesn't matter anymore. But so I wrote that story, and I managed to talk myself into it, and that Trump was going to win.
Right.
And so they put the story up literally 3 minutes, I think, after the AP called Wisconsin.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and you can find it. It's one of the most. I think it's probably the most widely read piece of
I wish
I'd
read it before I'm talking to you right now. How did you approach that? Because it's weird. You had to write a column explaining Trump's victory, kind of imagining it happening. Before it actually happened. What did you imagine, and what did you say in that column?
So obviously I couldn't say what states he won and that sort of thing, but it was, I didn't know what the particulars would be.
Yeah.
But I knew in general terms. I mean, it was obvious. His only hope was to win. Was to do really well with the white working class in the deindustrialized zones. That was obvious. That's where he was putting all his effort.
Yep.
And by the way, anybody who's observing the election can see this. That's what he's trying to do. The Democrats brushed it off and, said, well, that's not going to work. But I was in the New York Times in March of 2016. They did an interview with me. Maybe it was March, maybe it was April. You can easily find it. And it had a huge headline. It was an interview with me, and the headline said, Hillary needs to woo the working class. I know.
Yeah.
It's just like there were so many people saying this.
Oh, Bernie Sanders. I mean, the whole Bernie Sanders phenomenon is in part.
Saying it. Everybody was saying
everybody in those crowds that came to the Bernie Sanders, and I think that in a weird way, I mean, Bernie Sanders is the resistance. I feel like he's the only voice that's in government that is this loudly kind of clanging this bell about the working class and about the mistakes that the Democratic Party have made. Because it's weird because it's like they're not going to change even after losing elections.
Lots of Democrats know that these mistakes have been made. Everything that you and I have been talking about in this conversation.
Yeah.
For certain Democrats, this is common knowledge. They all know this.
Right.
What's interesting is that the kind of liberal intelligentsia or pundits in this country deny and deny and deny and deny. They will not acknowledge everything that we've said in this conversation.
They will not
acknowledge it.
That's insane.
It did not happen. It's not happening. None of what you're describing is the case.
People do not want single-payer health care, Thomas. They do not want it.
The Democrats. It starts with the Democrats don't have a problem with working-class people. That's not a problem. That's not an issue.
Oh God.
And then you point out, well, they do, and then By the way, so this has been like a long-running theme, was all of these pundits who reacted to what's the matter with Kansas by saying, no, that's not happening, that's not a problem, we don't have to worry about the white working class. And now with Trump, they've all sort of acknowledged, okay, so yeah, we do have to worry about this, but then they have this fallback position, which is there's nothing we can do to win those people back.
That's
because
amazing.
They're racist.
Yeah, right. Wow.
Yeah, the immediate fallback is there's nothing we can do about this.
Yeah.
Now, you ask yourself, why would anyone, of course there's something you can do. Of course you can win people. These are people, a lot of them voted for Obama, for Pete's sake.
Yep.
A lot of them voted for Clinton, and they voted for Jimmy Carter. And, this is a long-running process. It's been going on for decades now.
Yeah.
Of course you can win these people back. But they don't want to do the things they would have to do to win them back, because that means sort of abandoning this whole shift in the Democratic Party that we've been talking about. That means giving up on the consensus with the Republicans on neoliberalism. That means going back to Bill Clinton and putting everything in, going back to the early 70s and saying, okay, we made a mistake.
Yeah.
They're not going to do that.
And also, they're scared of losing donors too. They're scared of losing
they've gained donors. They're doing very well in that front. Hillary outraised Trump 2-1. Remember?
Well, no, I mean, I think they're afraid if they move to a working class, political sensibility that they'll lose Wall Street.
They'll lose yes, and that's true. They will.
Right.
That's true. However, as Trump teaches us. Yes. There's more than one way to win an election.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure you've seen this, and we can. maybe wrap this conversation up with this, but I'm sure you've seen this and it kind of like touches on a lot of the work you've done over the years. I feel like is the Trump, on the Friday before the election, on the Friday before that Tuesday election, he released a video that was like a 2 or 3 minute trailer that was kind of like very well produced summary of his argument for why he should be president. It didn't contain any.
I've seen it.
Yeah, it didn't contain any build the wall stuff. It didn't contain any like really xenophobic nativism or anything like that. It was all about the economy, and it was all about
I've seen it.
Yeah, you've been left behind.
I've seen that ad, and if you watch that ad with your eyes closed, so that ad was much criticized because all the figures that he shows as emblems of the economic elite are Jews. And and that's true. I mean, it does, right? It's like Blankfein, Yellen, George Soros. It's like,
right.
But if you close your eyes while you're watching it, and you don't see that, and all you hear is the voiceover, which is Trump giving a speech, it sounds exactly like Bernie Sanders.
Yes. Yep.
And by the way, it was meant to sound like Bernie Sanders because Trump. This is politics 101, but when the other side has had this sort of brutal primary battle, you try to peel off those voters. Reagan did the same thing with Kennedy voters in 1980.
That's right. Yep.
That's what you do. And he was doing it. And the Clinton people could not see it and could not hear it, and to this day deny it.
God, the Democrats are so fucking stupid. I'm sorry, but it's just it's insane.
No, this is the latest argument that I encounter this all the time. That there is this determination among Democrats to deny that Trump won with an economic critique.
Right.
That it was his victory was only attributable to racism,
which is not.
No,
it can't be
sexism. Now, it was of course in part attributable to racism and sexism. No question about it.
Yep.
No question at all. But that commercial, yes, Trump was hitting the economic discontent notes fortissimo. I mean, he was playing it as loud as he could, and they didn't see it, and they didn't hear it, and they didn't pay attention. And now look at what's happened.
Yeah. And I don't know where we go as a nation from here. I don't know where the Democrats go as kind of building a party.
The Democrats. That's a really easy question to answer. They sit around and wait for him to screw up.
Yeah, that's it.
Which is what they always do.
That's
what they did with Reagan, and that's what they did with Bush, and that strategy works for them sometimes. And they'll get back in eventually, and they'll but that's their strategy.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's it.
It's such a horrifying thing to consider that the Democrats are not going to, despite all these things we've talked about, in this conversation, that seem like they're obvious things. They seem like in order to
they're incredibly obvious. Everybody can see them.
Yep.
But we are in denial as a party, as a group of liberals. They're the leadership of the party. Like I said earlier, there are lots of politicians who agree with what I'm saying because they saw it with their own eyes. They've seen it in their district.
Yeah.
They've seen people that used to be their supporters go for Trump.
God.
It's happening.
Yeah.
It happened all over the country.
Yeah.
They have seen it happening. But it's the party, it's the pundits and the columnists and the political scientists, those people who will deny this until they die. Until it's all over. And by the way, just to throw in here, I can't get my argument into any American publication. I have to take this is all I can only do it through the Guardian now, a British publication.
Wow. Well, you're always welcome to come on podcasts. Yeah, the podcast industry is exploding, so you can always find a voice there. But that's amazing. Thanks so much for talking to me. I feel like your work and your ideas have been really formative to me, and they've come up many times in my work as a historian and many times on this show. So Thomas Frank, thanks so much for joining me and talking with me today.
Hey, this was my pleasure. It's a lot of fun.
Okay, I want to thank my guest, Thomas Frank. I had a great time talking with him. He's someone who I have wanted to have a conversation with for a long time. So I hope you enjoyed that, and you can check out his new book, Listen Liberal, which is everywhere, and is a nice little prescription for the Democrats. I think a lot of people who listen to this show would appreciate the arguments that he makes in this his new book. So check that out from Thomas Frank. And again, thanks for listening to the show, and thanks for the people supporting the show. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap is where you can subscribe for $5 a month, bonus episodes, and supporting a show that is trying very desperately to bring these voices to wider and wider audiences. So thanks again, and we will see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.